The morning Marin Cole left the Navy, no one came to see her off. That was how she wanted it. No ceremony, no handshakes in the cold, no speeches about service and sacrifice delivered by men who would return to warm offices while she carried a duffel bag to a truck that had been sitting in the base parking lot for 11 days, gathering a thin layer of frost on the windshield. The gate guard nodded once as she passed through. She nodded back. That was the entirety of it, 20 years of her life, reduced to a single exchange of acknowledgement between two people who would never see each other again. Ranger walked beside her, matching her pace exactly as he always had. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, large and deliberate, his thick sable and black coat pressing against her leg in the way it had during 100 different moments across a dozen different countries. His amber eyes moved steadily across the parking lot, checking corners, scanning roof lines, reading the space around them, the same way he had been trained to do in places far more dangerous than a naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. Marin had spent her career in explosive ordnance disposal. She had walked toward things that other people ran away from. She had knelt in the dirt of places most Americans would never find on a map, working with careful hands, while Ranger stood nearby, his nose sorting through layers of air and earth and machinery to find the thing that wanted to kill her before it could. They had done this together for years. They had done it so many times that it no longer felt like courage. It simply felt like work. The Navy doctors had a different word for what had happened to her left hand. They called it a cumulative pressure injury. The result of too many years working near controlled detonations, too many vibrations absorbed through bone and tissue that the body was never designed to absorb indefinitely. The tremor had started small, a faint quiver in her fingers after long shifts that she ignored for months. Then it became something harder to ignore. Then it became something the evaluation board could not overlook. They had been kind about it, genuinely kind, which somehow made it worse. She stood at the truck for a moment before opening the door. The Atlantic wind came in off the harbor carrying salt and the distant smell of diesel and coal metal. She was 45 years old. She stood just under 5'9", lean from decades of physical discipline, with dark brown hair cut short and touched with early gray at the temples. A thin scar crossed her right eyebrow, a souvenir from a mission that never made any official report. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of the ocean in winter, and they held the particular steadiness of someone who had learned to stay very still on the inside, regardless of what was happening on the outside. She opened the truck door. Ranger jumped in behind her without being told. She started the engine and drove away from the gate without looking in the rearview mirror. The drive across Norfolk took 25 minutes. Marin had made it hundreds of times over the years in all kinds of weather, at all kinds of hours. She knew which streets flooded first in heavy rain, which intersections had timing issues in the morning, which neighborhoods had changed, and which had stayed stubbornly the same across all the years she had moved in and out of this city between deployments. The house sat on a quiet road near the edge of a neighborhood built for military families in the 1970s. 2 stories, pale yellow, siding a small front porch with a wooden railing Garrett had repainted 3 years ago, in the brief window when things between them had still felt fixable. The maple in the front yard was bare, its branches stripped clean by the November wind. She noticed the front porch light was off. She noticed the curtains were open in a way that felt wrong, too. Open like windows with no one behind them. She parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment with the engine running. Ranger lifted his head from the back seat and watched her through the gap between the headrests. She turned off the engine. The front door was locked, which told her nothing. She used her key, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The living room was empty. Not untidy, not rearranged, empty. The couch was gone. The wooden coffee table Garrett had built himself one winter was gone. The bookshelf along the far wall had disappeared, leaving only pale rectangular ghosts on the paint where it had stood. The framed photographs that had lined the hallway were gone, every one of them leaving small dark holes where the hanging hardware had been pulled out. Marin walked forward slowly. Her boots made sound on the bare wooden floor that the furniture had always softened before. Ranger moved beside her quietly, his nails barely audible, his nose working the air. The kitchen cabinets half cleared, a few dishes left behind, as if someone had run out of room or patience. The bedroom closet standing open, most of the hangers bare. She stood in the center of the living room for a long time. Then she called him. Garrett answered on the 4th ring. His voice was careful in the way voices become when a person has been rehearsing what to say for a long time and still hasn't found the right version. I didn't know exactly when you'd be back, he said. I'm back now. There was a silence that stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Garrett Cole was 42 years old. He had spent most of those years being patient, patient while Marin deployed, patient while communication went dark for weeks at a time, patient while the holiday plans got canceled and the anniversaries came and went with a card sent from somewhere he couldn't find on a map. He taught high school history in a suburb of Norfolk, and he was genuinely good at it, the kind of teacher students remembered 20 years later. He was steady and kind and capable of enormous loyalty. He had also reached the end of something he could not rebuild on his own. Marin, he said, I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry. She looked at the empty wall where the photographs had been. Where are you? She asked. He told her. He was staying with his brother in Richmond. He had tried to time the move carefully, tried to be gone before she returned, not out of cowardice, but because he thought it would be cleaner that way, less painful in the immediate term. She told him she understood. She meant it the way a person means something when they are still standing inside the shock of it before the full weight arrives. After the call ended, she stood in the empty room for another long moment. Ranger came to her and pressed his shoulder against her leg. She reached down without thinking and rested her hand briefly on the back of his neck. All right, she said quietly. To herself or to him or to the room. She wasn't sure. She walked to the bedroom to collect the things she had left behind on her last deployment, a few items she hadn't been able to bring and had trusted the house to keep. On the closet shelf, she found what she expected, a folded sweater, a wooden box her father had given her, a small stack of letters she'd never thrown away. And then she found the thing she had not expected. It was a shoebox pushed to the back corner of the top shelf. She almost didn't pull it down. She almost left it, assumed it was Garrett's, and walked away. But something made her reach for it. Inside the shoebox was a smaller box, a medical specimen kit from a private clinic. A sealed envelope rested beneath it. She recognized Garrett's handwriting on the front. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated 18 months ago. The handwriting was less careful than his usual style, the letters slightly uneven in the way handwriting becomes when the hand is shaking. He wrote that she had been unreachable for 6 weeks. A communications blackout during a deployment she couldn't discuss. He wrote that during those 6 weeks, something had happened that he hadn't known how to tell her when she finally resurfaced, and then time had passed, and then more time, and the distance between the moment and the telling had grown until it felt impossible to cross. He wrote that she had been pregnant, that she hadn't known, that the pregnancy had ended on its own during those 6 weeks, and that he had been alone in the hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning, and that he had not called her family because he didn't know what to say, and that he had driven home alone and sat in the kitchen until sunrise. He wrote that he had carried it for 18 months waiting for the right moment. He wrote that there had never been a right moment. He wrote that he was sorry. Marin sat down on the closet floor. Ranger came and sat beside her, close enough that his warmth reached through her jacket. He didn't make a sound. He simply stayed. She read the letter twice. She looked at the medical box without opening it. Outside, the wind moved through the bare maple tree and made the branches knock softly against the side of the house. She sat there for a long time, long enough for the light in the room to change, for the pale winter afternoon to begin its early collapse toward darkness. She had carried a great many things across a great many years. She had learned to carry them efficiently, to distribute the weight so that it didn't slow her down to keep moving, because stopping was always more dangerous than forward motion. That was the fundamental lesson of her career. You don't stop in the middle of the road. But she sat on the closet floor for a long time. Eventually she stood. She placed the letter back in the shoebox and put the shoebox in her duffel bag. She collected the wooden box her father had given her, the folded sweater, the small stack of letters. She zipped the bag closed. She called Garrett one more time. He answered immediately. The house, she said. Is your name on the mortgage? Jointly, yes. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the transfer. Keep whatever you need from the joint account to cover the overlap. I won't contest anything. A long pause. Marin, you don't have to. I know, she said. Take care of yourself, Garrett. She ended the call. She looked around the empty room one final time. Then she walked out of the house, down the porch steps and across the dead grass of the front yard to the truck. Ranger was already waiting at the passenger door. She opened it for him, walked around to the driver's side and sat behind the wheel. She pulled a folded road map from the glove compartment, an actual paper map, the kind she still preferred because paper didn't need a signal and didn't offer suggestions and simply showed you where things were. She opened it across the steering wheel. Her eyes moved west across the map, across Virginia, across the slow rise of the Appalachians, across the long flat center of the country until they reached Wyoming. Cedar Bluff, population 1,841. A town she had not seen in more than 20 years. A town she had driven away from at 18 with a certainty she could not fully articulate the knowledge that she needed something larger, something that would push against her in ways that small places could not. She had found that something. She had found it many times over in forms she hadn't anticipated. Now she folded the map back along its creases and started the engine. The drive took 3 days. She did not hurry. She stopped when she needed gas aid at roadside diners, where the coffee came in heavy ceramic mugs and the waitstaff didn't make conversation unless invited. She slept in the truck both nights, reclined in the driver's seat with Ranger stretched across the back, both of them warm enough under the blanket she kept behind the seat. She had slept in worse places under worse conditions. The land changed as she moved west. Virginia's dense winter forest gave way to the slow flattening of the Midwest, the horizon pulling back to accommodate the enormous sky. Then the sky itself changed. It became taller, somehow. Bluer, the clouds moving at different speeds and distances than the clouds she had known on the eastern coast. The air dried as they climbed in elevation, losing the thick Atlantic humidity that she had lived inside for 20 years without fully registering. She rolled the window down somewhere in Nebraska and let the cold in. Ranger lifted his nose immediately. His ears came forward and turned slightly, reading the wind. Something in the quality of his attention changed, not the sharp operational focus she knew from working environments, but something older and less definable. Recognition, perhaps. The body's memory of a place before the mind has caught up. She watched him in the rearview mirror for a moment. "Yeah," she said, "getting closer." He looked at her once, then turned back to the window. Wyoming arrived with a different kind of cold. Not the wet, penetrating cold of coastal Virginia, but something drier and more austere, a cold that came with clarity rather than dampness. The landscape opened into wide valley floors bracketed by mountain ranges whose peaks carried fresh snow. Pine forests covered the slopes in dense dark green that absorbed the winter light. The sky overhead was the particular pale blue of high altitude in November, enormous and unhurried. She had forgotten this, or she hadn't forgotten it exactly, she had stopped thinking about it, which was different. The body had retained something that the deliberate mind had set aside. The highway curved through a shallow canyon, and then the valley opened again, and there was the wooden sign at the road's edge, its painted letters weathered to a pale shadow of their original red. Cedar Bluff, Wyoming. She slowed without deciding to. The town looked almost exactly as she remembered, which surprised her even though it shouldn't have. Small towns in Wyoming did not transform at the pace of coastal cities. They changed slowly, if at all, a new business appearing where an old one had closed a building, repainted in a slightly different shade, a road resurfaced so that the potholes she had memorized in childhood were suddenly gone. But the bones of the place remained. The same main street running east to west. The same brick storefronts, some active, some shuttered. The same water tower at the north end with the town's name in letters that had once seemed enormous to a child looking up at them. She drove through, slowly taking it in without stopping. The old diner was still there, its neon sign dark in the middle of the afternoon. The hardware store. The post office in its squat cement building. The small park where she had spent summer evenings as a teenager, too restless to be at home and with nowhere particular to go. Ranger was standing in the back seat now, his front paws against the window, watching. She turned off the main street and climbed the gentle grade toward the older residential edges of town, where the houses sat farther apart on wider lots, surrounded by tall ponderosa pines that had been growing since before any of the current residents were born. She knew the road. She had walked it thousands of times. Ridden a bicycle down it, learned to drive on it, left it behind at 18 without looking back. Her hands knew the turns without instruction from her conscious mind. The house appeared at the end of the road. It sat on a small rise above a field that was white with old snow crusted and gray at the edges where it had partially melted and refrozen over the course of several weeks. The house itself was smaller than memory had made it. They always were. The white paint had faded to a dull, uneven gray, and several boards on the porch railing had cracked or separated from their fasteners. The yard was overgrown beneath the snow-dried weed stalks pushing through the white in uneven clusters. But it was still standing. She parked on the gravel shoulder and sat looking at it through the windshield for a long time. The pine trees around the property moved slowly in the wind. A bird crossed between the branches and disappeared. She remembered her mother on the porch swing on warm evenings, a cup of coffee resting on the railing beside her. She remembered her father in the field below, working on something in the long summer light that lasted until nearly 9 in the evening. She remembered the smell of the kitchen in winter, something always on the stove, the windows fogged with warmth. Ranger pushed open the truck door himself the way he had learned to do years ago, when she forgot to do it first. He landed on the frozen gravel and immediately began trotting toward the house. "Ranger," she called. He didn't stop. He moved through the overgrown yard with his nose working the air, his tail beginning a slow, rhythmic movement that she almost never saw from him in unfamiliar environments. He circled the base of the porch steps twice and sat and looked at the front door. Then he looked back at her. She walked toward the house. There was a wooden post near the driveway gate with a real estate sign attached white letters on a dark green background, the name of a local agency and a phone number. Below the sign, a smaller notice had been stapled, a municipal document with a county seal at the top. She pulled it free and read it. The language was administrative and dry, but the meaning was clear enough. The property had been flagged for delinquent tax debt accumulated over multiple years following the last owner's departure. Under Wyoming County reclamation statutes, if the property remained unsold at public auction within 30 days of the notice date, it would transfer to county receivership for commercial redevelopment assessment. The notice was dated 20 days ago. 11 days left. She read the number on the real estate sign. The broker's name was listed as Callum Reed Cedar Bluff Realty. She called the number. A man answered, steady voice unhurried, the particular pace of someone who had spent a lifetime operating at the tempo of a small town without apology. She told him she was standing in front of the property on Pinetop Road. She told him she wanted to buy it. A brief pause. "Have you looked at the interior?" "Not yet. It needs significant work." "I know." Another pause. She could hear him pulling something from a drawer, the rustle of paper. "I can be there in 40 minutes, he said. Callum Reed was 53 years old, lean and weathered with the particular physical economy of a man who had spent decades doing practical things in a demanding climate. His gray-brown hair was cut close, and his handshake was direct when they met in the driveway. He looked at Ranger once with the calm assessment of someone accustomed to working dogs, then shifted his attention to the paperwork. They sat on the hood of his truck because there was no furniture. He walked her through the terms without embellishment, explained the tax lien process, clearly answered her questions without filler. She signed the final document, so while the late afternoon light went copper across the snow of the field below. He handed her a key on a plain metal ring. "You grew up here," he said. It wasn't a question. He had recognized her name immediately, with the quiet way small towns retain their histories in the memories of the people who stayed. "Yes." He looked at the house for a moment. "Your parents were good people," he said. The simple past tense of it landed with a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped feeling it as a distinct thing. "They were," she said. He drove away as the light was failing. She stood at the base of the porch steps with Ranger beside her and the key in her hand. The door opened with resistance. The frame had settled unevenly over the years, warping slightly. She had to put her shoulder into it. It gave with a low grinding complaint and swung inward. The interior smelled of coal wood and time. Dust hung in the thin beams of remaining daylight that came through the windows. The floors were bare and the walls bare, and the fireplaces cold, but the structure was intact, the beams, the walls, the staircase rising along the left side of the hallway. It was the skeleton of a place she had known completely stripped of everything that had once made it specific, but still recognizable in its proportions, in the particular way the light fell through the western windows in late afternoon. She walked through the room slowly. In the living room, she found what she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. Along the interior wall beside the staircase, still visible through the thin coat of old paint, were the pencil marks. Lines at intervals up the wall, each one labeled in her mother's careful hand. Marin age 6, Marin age 8, Marin age 10, Marin age 13. She stood in front of them for a long time. The marks had survived every year of the house's vacancy. No one had painted over them, or if someone had tried, the pencil had pressed deeply enough into the plaster that the lines showed through anyway. Ranger came to stand beside her. He looked at the wall, then at her. She reached out and traced one of the lines with her fingertip. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the pine trees and made them shift and speak in the darkness that was settling fast across the valley. Inside the old house, it was very cold and very quiet. But Marin Cole was not running anymore. She went back to the truck and retrieved the duffel bag and the blanket in the small wooden box her father had given her years ago on a morning she still remembered clearly. She brought Ranger's water bowl and filled it from the bottle she kept in the cab. She found the flashlight in the glove compartment and set it on the floor in the center of the living room, pointing toward the ceiling, spreading its light in a soft cone that reached the corners of the room. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall beneath the pencil marks and the blanket across her legs. Ranger circled twice and lay down beside her, his back against her thigh, his head resting on his front paws. His eyes remained open for a while, watching the dark beyond the windows. Then slowly, gradually, they closed. The wind pressed against the old glass of the windows. Somewhere in the pine trees outside, something moved and settled. The house made the sounds that old houses make when the temperature drops, small adjustments. The slow conversation of wood and nail and plaster shifting against each other in the cold. For the first time since leaving the base that morning, for the first time in longer than she could accurately calculate, Marin stopped thinking about what came next. She sat in the cold and the dark of the house where she had grown up beneath the pencil marks that her mother had made with such ordinary care across so many years, and she let the silence be what it was. She did not sleep. She simply stayed. Ranger breathed slowly beside her, steady as a clock. Outside, the first snow of the evening had begun to fall on Cedar Bluff, covering the old gravel drive and the frozen field below, and the road that had brought her back here quietly, without announcement, the way things sometimes return to the places they belong. The cold that settled over Cedar Bluff that first week was the kind that arrived without drama and intended to stay. Marin woke on the floor of the living room each morning before the light came. Ranger pressed against her side, both of them warm enough beneath the blanket she had brought from the truck. The house had no working heat. The furnace in the basement had been disconnected years ago, its fuel line capped and its components stripped for parts by someone who had assumed no one would need them again. The stone fireplace in the living room was intact, but Marin spent the first 2 days clearing decades of accumulated soot from the flue before she trusted it enough to light. When she finally did, the fire caught cleanly and the room changed around it. Not into comfort exactly, but into something less hostile. The old stones absorbed the heat slowly and released it slowly, the way good material always does. She worked methodically through the house in those first days, the way she had always worked, assessing before acting and understanding the full scope of a problem before committing to a solution. She made lists on a yellow legal pad she found in the truck's glove compartment. The roof had 2 soft spots she could identify from the inside by the water staining on the ceiling boards. 3 windows needed new glazing. The porch railing was beyond repair and would need to be rebuilt entirely. The kitchen plumbing groaned when she opened the main water valve, but held. She drove into town for supplies. She bought what she needed at the hardware store and the small grocery on the main street and exchanged the minimum required conversation with the people behind the counters. Cedar Bluff was the kind of town where strangers were processed quickly and filed appropriately, newcomer, visitor, returning family, or outsider with intentions unclear. She understood that she fell into the returning category even after 22 years away, because small towns had long institutional memories, and the Cole family had been part of this one for 2 generations. She was recognized at the hardware store by a woman her mother's age who said her name with the particular warmth of someone reaching across a long gap. "Marin Cole, your mother would be so glad." Marin thanked her and carried her lumber to the truck. She was not ready for those conversations yet. She didn't know when she would be. The nights were the hardest part, not for the reasons she might have expected, not grief or regret or the accumulated weight of everything she had driven away from. The nights were hard because the house was quiet in a way that she had lost the ability to inhabit. 20 years of operational life had recalibrated her nervous system toward vigilance. She slept into fragments, woke at sounds that turned out to be nothing. The house settling wind against the glass, a branch moving against the corner of the roof. Ranger would lift his head each time she stirred, assess the room, determine there was no threat, and lower his head again with a patience she found both steadying and quietly humbling. On the fifth night, he found the wall. She had just built the evening fire and was sitting on the floor with her back against the couch she had borrowed from a second-hand shop in town, the only piece of furniture she had acquired so far, a heavy thing in brown corduroy that had probably been in someone's den since 1987. She was reading through the hardware store receipts and revising her materials list when Ranger stood up from his position near the hearth. He moved to the far side of the fireplace where the stone surround met the original wooden paneling of the wall. He lowered his nose to the baseboard and worked slowly along the seam between the stone and the wood, the way she had watched him work 1,000 times in 1,000 different locations, that particular quality of attention that meant he had found a differential in the air, a place where something beneath the surface was different from what surrounded it. Ranger. He looked at her once. Then he put his paw against the paneling. She knew the behavior. She had built her career around the behavior. She set down the legal pad and stood. The panel he was indicating looked identical to the others, at first the same age pine, the same faint darkening from years of fireplace smoke. But when she pressed her palm flat against it, she felt what she should not have felt. Slight movement, a fraction of an inch, but enough. She retrieved the multi-tool from her jacket pocket. She had not gone a day without one since her early 20s, and worked carefully along the seam. No force, just patience and the precise application of leverage at the right points. The panel was not nailed. It had been set in place and held by friction and time, designed to be removable by someone who knew it was there. It came free with a soft sound, a small exhalation of air from the space behind it. She shone her flashlight into the opening. The space inside the wall was roughly the size of a shoebox, formed by the gap between two studs, and lined on the back with old insulation paper that had gone brittle and amber with age. Inside the space, resting against the back wall, were two envelopes, and between them, wrapped in a square of faded blue cloth, something small and solid. She reached in and took them out carefully. The envelopes were yellowed, their corners softened by years in that dry interior space. Each one had a name written on the front in handwriting she had not seen in years, in one case 8 years, in the other case 5. The first envelope was in her father's hand, angular and slightly rushed, the way he wrote everything. The second was in her mother's, rounded and careful, the letters formed with the deliberate quality of someone who had learned penmanship as a serious discipline and never abandoned it. Both envelopes read the same thing on the front: for Marin. She sat down on the floor with the envelopes in her lap and the fire behind her. Ranger came and sat beside her without being asked. For a while, she simply held them. The fire made small sounds. The wind pressed at the windows. Outside, Cedar Bluff was dark and cold, and going about the business of an ordinary winter night. She opened her father's letter first. The paper inside was fragile at the folds but intact. His voice came off the page immediately, the same blunt, honest cadence. She had grown up with a man who used exactly as many words as a thing required and no more. He wrote that they had hidden these letters before leaving the house on the last day when everything else had already been loaded or given away. He wrote that the chance of her ever finding them was small. He knew that and said so plainly, but that her mother had insisted, and he had learned across 40 years of marriage that her mother's instincts were worth following even when the logic was unclear. He wrote that if she was reading this, something remarkable had happened. He wrote that no matter how far a person travels or how long they stay away, the place where they started has a way of holding on to them quietly until they're ready to return. He wrote that he was proud of her, not for any specific thing, but for the full shape of who she had become. He wrote that he loved her in the simple, declarative way that serious men from his generation wrote such things briefly without adornment, in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. He signed it, "Your Dad." She sat with him that for a while. Then she opened her mother's letter. Her mother had written more. Her mother had always written more cards, notes left on the kitchen table, letters sent to whatever address the Navy provided, long and unhurried, and full of the specific details of ordinary life that Marin had sometimes skimmed on deployment and now wished she had read more carefully. This letter was the same. It moved through things slowly, the way her mother moved through things, the memory of teaching Marin to make pie crust on a winter afternoon when Marin was 9, the particular pride of watching her daughter stand straight and composed at her high school graduation, the strange mix of terror and admiration she had felt watching the news reports from regions she could never quite place, knowing her daughter was somewhere in them. She wrote about the house. She wrote that leaving it had broken something in her that she had never quite repaired. Not because of the building itself, but because of what it contained. Not the furniture or the objects, but the specific quality of air inside a place where a family has lived together across many years, the invisible accumulation of everything that happened there. She wrote that she and Marin's father had hidden the letters because they needed to believe that the house would find its way back to the right person. She wrote that she did not know if Marin would ever come back and that she had made her peace with either possibility, but that she had decided to hope anyway. She wrote that hope was not the same as expectation. Hope was simply the decision to leave a door open. She wrote, "You were always our greatest joy." Unwrapping the square of blue cloth, Marin found a silver ring, a simple band narrow with a small engraved pattern along the outer edge that she recognized immediately. She had seen it on her mother's right hand her entire childhood. Not the wedding ring, which was gold and wider, but the other one, the one her mother wore every day, the one she had never explained except to say that it had come from her own mother and that it mattered. A strip of paper was folded inside the cloth. 4 words in her mother's handwriting. "When you are ready, the fire had burned low." She sat in the dim room for a long time, both letters in her lap, the ring held in her closed left hand, the hand that trembled now, the hand that had disarmed 100 devices in a dozen countries and could no longer do so reliably. She held the ring, and the hand was still. Ranger leaned against her and did not move. She did not know exactly when she slept. She woke in the gray early morning with her back against the couch and the fire entirely cold, and Ranger still beside her watching the windows lighten. She placed both letters carefully on the wooden box her father had given her, which sat on the floor in the corner. She would find frames for them later. For now, she needed them somewhere she could see them. The storm arrived on the 8th day without much warning. The sky had been building toward it for 2 days, a low-pressure system, working down from the north, the temperature dropping in distinct steps, the wind shifting and steadying from the northwest. She had grown up reading weather in this valley, and her body remembered the pattern, even if her mind had stopped paying attention to it. She stacked extra wood on the porch before the first flakes came. By mid-afternoon, the snow was falling in heavy driven curtains, and the road leading down from the residential ridge into town had become difficult. By early evening, the power went out across Cedar Bluff, the whole town going dark at once, that particular sudden absence of ambient electrical sound that people who live in powered places don't notice until it stops. She put on her heavy coat. She loaded Ranger into the truck and drove down into town, carefully the headlights tunneling through the blowing white. Most people were staying in. A few cars were stopped at odd angles where they had slid off the crown of the road and couldn't get back on. She drove past them and headed for the center of town. The white church on the corner of Main and 4th had lights on inside, the warm, irregular light of candles and lanterns rather than electricity. A small crowd had gathered at its entrance. As she pulled up and stepped out, she could hear what was wrong, a portable generator sitting beside the church steps refusing to start. 2 men she didn't know were bent over it in the blowing snow, pulling the start cord with decreasing confidence. A third man, standing back from the generator, turned as she approached. He was in his early 50s, broad across the shoulders and chest, built like someone who had been doing hard physical work his entire adult life. A thick gray beard, deep-set eyes that assessed her with the directness of a person who had learned to evaluate people quickly and accurately across many years. He wore a canvas jacket that was inadequate for the temperature and didn't seem to notice. "Frank Delaney," he said, extending his hand. "Marin Cole." He looked at her for a moment the way Callum Reed had looked at her, that small recalibration that happened when a name landed against a memory. Then he stepped back from the generator and gestured at it. "Fuel's getting in, but she won't turn over," he said. She knelt beside the machine. The housing was cold and the pull cord was stiff. She opened the access panel and worked through it methodically, checking the components in the order her training had taught her. To check them, the fuel line first. The primer, the spark plug connection, the choke position. The choke was set wrong for the temperature. There was also ice in the fuel line, a small obstruction that could be cleared. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. She worked in the blowing snow without hurry. Ranger sat nearby, facing into the wind, scanning the street behind her. The 2 men who had been attempting the generator stood back and watched without comment. 8 minutes later, the machine turned over, ran rough for a few seconds, and then steadied into a reliable idle. Warm light flooded back into the church windows. From inside, she could hear the sound of people responding to it, not quite cheering, but something adjacent to it. The collective exhale of a room full of people who had been cold and uncertain and were now less so. Frank Delaney looked at the running generator, then at her. "You're Walt Cole's daughter," he said, "not a question." Yes, he was quiet for a moment. The snow moved between them. "You fix things the same way he did," Frank said. "Like you already know what's wrong before you open it up." She didn't answer that. She stood and dusted the snow off her knees. For the next several hours, she moved through town as the storm intensified, doing what needed to be done. She helped a car out of a snowbank with the tow chain she kept in the truck bed. She guided an elderly couple, Harold and Eunice Bram, in their late 70s, moving carefully through the deep snow on the sidewalk to the church shelter. Eunice held her arm and said something about her mother as they walked, something warm and specific that Marin filed away for later when she had the capacity to receive it. She was heading back toward the truck, thinking about getting Ranger water, when she heard him. Not a bark of sound she recognized from years of working with him, a sharp involuntary vocalization that he made only when he was hurt. She spun. Ranger was in the street. He had gotten out of the truck, somehow the door mechanism which she had never fully trusted, and had been trotting across the road toward her when the truck that couldn't see him in the blowing snow had caught his left front leg with its bumper. Not a direct strike, a glancing contact, but enough. He was on his side in the snow. She was across the street before she had finished processing what she had seen. She knelt over him in the road, her hands moving across his body with the same careful speed she had brought to everything else that required precision in crisis. He was conscious. His eyes were tracking. He was trying to get up, and she held him still with firm, steady pressure. "Easy," she said. Her voice was completely level. "Easy, Ranger. I've got you." The left front leg was wrong. The angle of it told her everything she needed to know. Frank Delaney was beside her within 30 seconds. "The vet," she said. "Where?" "Owen Walsh. His clinic is on Birchwood, 3 blocks south. I'll drive you stay with him." She rode in Frank's truck with Ranger across her lap, keeping him still, talking to him in a low, continuous voice, the way she had talked to him in dark places over CCs, when staying calm was a matter of survival for both of them. He did not struggle. He breathed carefully, his eyes on her face. The clinic was a low building set back from the road, its exterior lights still on, running off a backup battery. Frank laid on the horn for 10 seconds. A light came on inside. Owen Walsh came to the door in a flannel shirt and jeans, clearly pulled from sleep, moving with the immediate competence of someone accustomed to being needed at unreasonable hours. He was in his early 30s, lean and precise in his movements, with the particular calm of a person whose work regularly required suppressing his own response to a situation in order to be useful to the animal in front of him. He took Ranger from her arms and moved directly to the examination table without asking unnecessary questions. She stood against the wall while he worked, and she did not speak, and he did not ask her to leave. He understood somehow the way some people understand, without being told that removing her from the room would be the wrong thing. The leg was fractured. A clean break, he said, which was the better of the available outcomes. He set it and splinted it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times, explaining each step in a low, steady voice. Not for her benefit specifically, but as a general practice, keeping the language in the room calm had an effect on the animal that he had come to rely on. Ranger was sedated lightly by the end. His breathing was slow and even. His eyes were closed. Owen washed his hands at the sink and turned to face her. "He'll need 4 to 6 weeks before the leg carries weight," he said. "But the break is clean. He's strong. He'll recover." She nodded once. Owen looked at Ranger for a moment, then at her. Something shifted in his expression, a careful consideration as if he were deciding something. "The dog," he said. "The markings, the scar on his muzzle." He paused. "My father talked about a dog like this. Years ago, he used to say there was a woman who would come back for her family's things eventually, and when she did, the dog would probably be with her." Marin looked at him. "Your father," she said. "Ray Walsh." He dried his hands and set the towel aside. "He passed 2 years ago. But before he did, he made me promise to keep the storage unit paid up. Said it wasn't his property to let go." She was very still. "What storage unit?" she said. Owen looked at her with an expression that contained both the weight of his father's long silence and the particular relief of someone who has finally been given permission to set something down. He told her. The storage facility was on the eastern edge of town, 10 units in a low-metal building that had been there since the late 90s. Ray Walsh had been renting Unit 6 for 10 years and 4 months. He had paid the monthly fee without interruption through his retirement, through his illness, to within 3 months of his death, at which point Owen had taken over the payments because his father had made him promise. He said his father had never told him the full story of how it started. Only that Walt Cole had asked him to hold some things, and that the asking had not included a timeline or a plan for retrieval. That Walt had died before he could retrieve them, and that Ray had decided the obligation did not end with Walt's death. That the things in the unit belonged to Walt's daughter, and that if she ever came back, they should be there. After the storm passed and the road was clear enough for her truck, she drove to the storage facility with Owen and stood in the cold while he worked the lock on Unit 6. The roll door went up. She stood in the opening for a long moment without going in. She had told herself across many years that objects were not the same as people, that losing a house was not the same as losing the people inside it, that she had made her peace with the material dispossession that had accompanied her parents' final years in ways she only partially understood. But the things in that storage unit undid something in her that she had not known was still wound tight. The kitchen table where she had done 20 years of homework, the wooden chairs her grandfather had made, her mother's rocking chair with the worn armrests, box after box of books, kitchen things, the quilts from the cedar chest in the upstairs hall. All of it placed with care, organized by someone who understood that these things had meaning covered against dust. And on the nearest shelf, a flat wooden box she recognized immediately. Inside were newspaper clippings, dozens of them. Some yellowed and fragile, the oldest ones going back nearly 2 decades. Military deployment notices from the regional paper. A brief feature from a Navy publication about EOD training. A small photo from a base newsletter, her face barely visible, in a group of 8 people but circled in pencil. A copy of a commendation notice. Her parents had found these, had clipped them and saved them across all the years she had not come home. She stood in the cold of the storage unit holding the wooden box, and Owen Walsh stood at a respectful distance behind her, saying nothing. The snow had stopped. The sky above Cedar Bluff was clearing from the west, the stars beginning to appear at the edge of the darkness where the clouds had pulled back. Frank Delaney had been waiting in his truck in the parking lot. He climbed out when she emerged and walked toward her with his hands in his jacket pockets and the look of a man carrying something he has decided it is time to put down. "There's something I should have told you the day you arrived," he said, "about your father, about the house, Wakeo." She waited. He told her plainly in the way that Frank Delaney told everything without preamble, without softening, with the directness of a man who had decided that honesty was more respectful than comfort. Walt Cole had not lost the house to the bank. He had sold it, voluntarily, quietly, without telling anyone the full reason. A family in Cedar Bluff, the Harding family, whose name Marin vaguely remembered from childhood, had a son with leukemia. The treatment costs had exceeded everything they had. Walt Cole had sold his house and applied the proceeds toward the treatment fund and told everyone the bank had foreclosed because he did not want his daughter, deployed and unreachable and in danger, to spend a single moment of her operational life worrying about him or feeling responsible for something she could not have fixed from 10,000 miles away. Frank had known. He had been asked to keep the story straight. He had done it for 10 years and had carried the weight of it every day since Walt died. He looked at her steadily in the cold. "He said you had enough to worry about," Frank said. "He said protecting you was still his job, even if he couldn't do it the way he used to." The stars were fully out now above the valley, brilliant and motionless in the cold-cleared air. Marin stood in the parking lot of a storage facility in Cedar Bluff, Wyoming, holding a box of newspaper clippings that her parents had saved across 2 decades, and she understood something that she had not understood before. Her parents had not simply hoped she would return. They had arranged everything they could arrange, prepared every contingency they could prepare, and then trusted the rest to time. She had spent 20 years walking toward the most dangerous things she could find. Her parents had spent those same years quietly, without complaint, building the best possible version of the place she might someday come back to. Ranger was waiting for her at the clinic, his legs splinted, his eyes open and tracking when she came through the door. His tail moved slowly when he saw her. She sat down on the floor beside the examination table and put her hand against the side of his face. "You're going to be fine," she told him. His tail moved again. Outside Cedar Bluff was cold and quiet and covered in new snow, and the stars above the valley were clear and very far away and had been there long before any of this and would remain long after. Spring came to Cedar Bluff the way it always had, not as an announcement, but as a gradual accumulation of evidence. The snow along the north-facing edges of the property was the last to go, holding its position in the shadows of the ponderosa pines through most of March before finally conceding. The field below the house reappeared in stages, first as dark patches of soil pushing through the white, then as a continuous expanse of brown and gray that slowly across the weeks of April began to show the first faint suggestion of green. Marin noticed all of it. She had spent 20 years in environments that demanded total situational awareness, and that capacity did not switch off because the situation had changed. But what she noticed now was different in character from what she had trained herself to notice. It was not threat assessment. It was something quieter and more patient, the kind of attention that belonged to a person watching something grow. She worked on the house every day. The roof was first because it had to be. She spent 4 days on it in late February, patching the soft spots with new sheathing and laying fresh underlayment before the next round of weather came. She worked methodically and without hurry, moving across the slope of the roof with the same physical confidence she had brought to everything her body had been asked to do. The left hand tremored occasionally when she was cold and tired, but she had learned to work around it the way water works around a stone, not fighting it, simply finding the path that remained open. Ranger supervised from the yard below. His splinted leg kept him grounded for the first weeks of his recovery, which he accepted with a patience that she found both reassuring and faintly instructive. He had always been the steadier of the two of them in situations requiring stillness. Now he sat on the cold ground below the porch each morning and watched her work his ears, tracking the sounds of the neighborhood, his amber eyes returning to her at regular intervals, as if confirming she was still there. Owen Walsh came to check on the leg twice a week. He drove out from his clinic in a battered green pickup that had apparently belonged to his father and that he had declined to replace on grounds he never fully explained. He was quiet in the way that competent people are often quiet, not withdrawn, but sufficiently occupied by the work of observation that small talk seemed beside the point. He checked the splint, assessed the healing, adjusted the support wrap. He answered her questions directly and did not offer opinions she hadn't asked for. On his third visit, he brought 2 cups of coffee from the diner on Main Street because he had passed it on the way and thought she might want one. He left it on the porch railing without making it into a gesture. She drank it while he examined Ranger's leg and said nothing about it, and neither did he. He came back the following week with coffee again. She had the porch railing rebuilt, by then new lumber cut and fitted to match the original profile as closely as she could manage from the photographs in one of the albums she had retrieved from the storage unit. She had spent an evening studying those photographs carefully, not for the emotional content of them, though that was considerable, but for the architectural detail. The original railing had been built by her grandfather. She could see his choices in the proportions of it, in the spacing of the balusters, in the way the top rail was shaped. She replicated it as faithfully as her skill allowed. When Owen arrived that morning and saw the new railing, he stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked at it for a long moment before coming up. "That matches the old photographs," he said. "It should," she said. "I use them." He nodded slowly. He understood the impulse, she could see that he did, and he did not burden it with commentary. The kitchen plumbing was next, then the windows. She replaced the cracked glazing herself, working room by room, the old putty coming away in brittle pieces that crumbled between her fingers. New glass, new putty, painted sills. Each window she finished changed the quality of light in that room. The difference between a dirty pane and a clean one was considerable, and she noticed it each time with a quiet satisfaction that surprised her by its intensity. Frank Delaney appeared one Saturday morning in April with a truck bed full of lumber. He said he had been keeping in his barn for a project that was never going to happen. He did not ask if she wanted help. He simply pulled into the driveway, lowered the tailgate, and began unloading boards. She watched him from the porch. "The floor in the back bedroom," he said without looking up. "It's been soft since before your parents left. Walt always meant to fix it." She came down the steps and picked up the other end of the board he was carrying. They worked through the day without much conversation, which suited both of them. Frank had the particular competence of someone who had been solving practical problems in demanding conditions his entire adult life, and he worked alongside her in the way that skilled people work alongside each other, reading the task, anticipating the next step, staying out of each other's way without having to negotiate it. By late afternoon, the back bedroom floor was solid. He refused coffee and drove away before the sun was fully down. She stood on the repaired porch and watched his taillights disappear around the curve of Pinetop Road. There were things she was not yet ready to address. She knew where they were. They sat quietly at the edges of her days, patient in the way that important things are patient, undemanding in the short term, but present. The letter Garrett had left. The medical box still in her duffel bag moved from Norfolk and placed on the closet shelf in the master bedroom where it sat undisturbed. The question of what came next in any broader sense, whether Cedar Bluff was a destination or a way station, whether the work of rebuilding the house would eventually point toward a life inside it, or simply resolve itself and leave her again without a clear direction. She did not try to force those questions to resolution. She had learned across years of working with unstable systems that forcing resolution before a system was ready produced outcomes worse than patience. She let the questions sit. The day Owen brought the box was the first genuinely warm morning of the year, the temperature climbing into the high 50s by 10 o'clock, the sky a clear and specific blue, the field below the house catching the light in a way that made the new grass appear almost luminous. She had the front door open and was working on the staircase risers when she heard his truck in the driveway. He came up the porch steps carrying a wooden box she recognized immediately. It was flat, roughly the size of a large book made of pine, with a simple latch on the front. She had seen it in the storage unit on the night of the storm, and had noted it and moved past it in the particular way she had of registering things she was not ready to open. Owen set it on the porch railing. "I thought you should have this at the house," he said, "rather than out there." She looked at the box. "My father kept it separate from the other things," Owen said. "On the shelf near the door. I think he looked at it sometimes." She picked it up. It was lighter than she expected, or perhaps she had been bracing for more weight than it contained. She carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table, which she had retrieved from storage and restored to its original position against the east wall of the kitchen, the same wall it had occupied throughout her entire childhood. She opened the latch. The newspaper clippings she had seen before she had taken them home from the storage unit that night, and placed them in the wooden box her father had given her, which now lived on the shelf in the living room. But beneath the clippings was a second layer she had not reached before, a layer she had stopped short of because she had run out of capacity that night and had closed the box before she was done. Beneath the clippings were letters, a small bundle of them tied with kitchen twine that had once been white and had faded to a pale tan. She recognized the handwriting on the top envelope immediately because she had been reading that handwriting off yellow legal pads and birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen table for the first 18 years of her life. Her mother had written to Garrett. Not one letter, several. The earliest postmark was 14 years ago. The most recent was 8 years ago, which placed it in the last year of her mother's life after the diagnosis and before the final months when writing had become difficult. She untied the twine and sorted through them slowly. Most of them were short. Her mother had never been a person to use words unnecessarily, despite what Marin had believed as a child when the kitchen table notes had seemed endless. Reading them now, she understood that her mother had been economical, that the length was appropriate to the content, not a product of excess. The letters spoke to Garrett with a directness and warmth that moved her. Her mother had written to him as someone she considered family, which was what he had been, and she had written about Marin with the particular combination of pride and worry and unconditional love that Marin had always known was there, but had rarely seen expressed in language. And in the second-to-last letter, her mother had written the thing that Owen's father had apparently read and decided was too important to keep in a storage unit. It was addressed to Garrett by name. It began by acknowledging what her mother called the honest difficulty of waiting for someone who could not always tell you where they were or what they were doing or when they would return. It acknowledged that this kind of waiting had a cost that was real, and that accumulating that cost across years was not weakness, but simply the natural limit of what any person could sustainably bear. Her mother wrote, "If the day comes when you cannot continue, I will not hold it against you. I want you to know that clearly and without condition." You have given my daughter more patience and loyalty than most people are capable of. Whatever you decide, that is true." She wrote, "What I ask, the only thing I ask, is that when that day comes, you find a way to point her home. She will not know she needs to come back. She never does. But she will need to. There is something here waiting for her that she cannot find anywhere else, and I will not be here to tell her that myself." She wrote, "Please help her find her way back." The letter was signed with her mother's name and a single line beneath it that read, "Thank you for loving her as well as you did." Marin sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Through the open front door, she could hear the morning, a light wind in the pines, somewhere in the middle distance, a hawk making its ascending call, the faint sound of traffic on the main road below the ridge, carrying the ordinary commerce of a Thursday morning in a small Wyoming town. Ranger was on the porch in the sun, his recovering leg extended carefully, his nose sorting the warm air. She thought about Garrett sitting alone in the hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning. She thought about him receiving a letter from her mother and keeping it, keeping all of them, keeping them carefully, keeping them long enough and well enough that they had survived to arrive in her hands now. She thought about him sending them back. He had said nothing in the package he had forwarded from the address she had given his lawyer. No note, no explanation. Just the bundle tied in kitchen twine addressed in her mother's hand. That restraint she thought was his own kind of love. She was still at the table when Owen knocked on the open door. She had not heard his truck leave. He had apparently stayed not intrusively, not visibly, simply present in the driveway, in case he was needed and prepared to leave quietly if he was not. She looked up at him, standing in the doorway with the morning light behind him. This careful, precise, patient man who had kept a storage unit paid up for 2 years because his dying father had asked him to. "I'll come back another time," he said. "No," she said. "Come in." He came in and sat across the table from her. He looked at the letters and then looked at her and then looked out the window at the field below the house where the grass was coming up green in the morning light. "She wrote to him for years," Marin said. "I know. My father told me she did. She asked him to help me find my way back." Owen was quiet for a moment. "And he did," he said simply. She thought about that, about the chain of it, her mother writing the letters, Garrett keeping them, sending them, without explanation at the precise moment when they could do the most work. Ray Walsh keeping the storage unit across a decade out of respect for a promise made to a man who died. Owen keeping it paid up for 2 more years because his father had asked him to. Frank Delaney carrying the truth about the house sale for 10 years before determining the time had come to set it down. All of it running quietly in the background of her life, invisible to her, maintained by people she had barely thought about across 20 years of deployment and mission and forward motion. She had believed she came back to Cedar Bluff on her own, driven by instinct, by Ranger's nose pointing west, by the random circumstance of a house, with 11 days left before the county took it. She understood now that the path had been built for her piece by people who loved her without requiring that she know they were doing it. She picked up the ring from where she had placed it on the table that morning. She had begun keeping it near her in a way she hadn't fully explained to herself. The silver band narrowed the small engraved pattern on the outer edge that she had memorized before she was old enough to read. She put it on the ring finger of her left hand. Her mother had said, "When you are ready." She was not sure she was entirely ready. She suspected that might be the wrong standard. She was here, which was a start. The hand that held the ring trembled slightly in the way it always did now, and the ring sat on it without regard for that solid and specific and old enough to have meant something to 3 generations of women before it reached her. Owen watched her and did not comment. Ranger came in from the porch and walked to his water bowl and drank the sound of it filling the kitchen in a comfortable, ordinary way. His gait was uneven, still the healing leg carried with care, but Owen had told her the previous week that the recovery was ahead of schedule. Another 2 weeks and the splint could come off. Another month after that, and he would be, if not exactly the dog he had been, then close enough to it that the difference would not much matter. She stood and went to the shelf in the living room where the wooden box held the letters she had framed. The frames were simple. She had bought them at the hardware store. Nothing elaborate, just clean wood and glass to protect the paper. She had hung them on the wall to the left of the fireplace at the beginning of March and had not moved them since. Below the frames she had placed the photograph, the one that Owen had brought when he came a second time after Ranger was stabilized and the storm had passed. He had found it in his father's effects, a printed photograph tucked inside the same wooden box with the clippings, and he had thought she should have it. It showed her parents standing beside a half-built wooden bridge over the river that ran through the south end of Cedar Bluff. A group of people surrounded them. She could see Frank Delaney younger by 2 decades, recognizable by the particular set of his shoulders. She could see other faces she half recognized from childhood, older now, or gone. Her father was in the center with a beam across his shoulders. Her mother stood beside him with her hand resting on a wooden support, as if she had helped raise it into place, which she probably had. The bridge was still standing. She had driven over it on her second day in Cedar Bluff without knowing whose hands had built it. She stood in front of the photograph for a while. Then she went back to the kitchen and refilled both cups and sat down. Owen accepted the cup and wrapped both hands around it. "My father said your father built that bridge because someone told him the town couldn't afford to," Owen said. "He said Walt Cole had a strong reaction to being told something couldn't be done." "That sounds right," she said. "Apparently he organized everyone in about 2 weeks. My father said he'd never seen anything get built that fast in Cedar Bluff." She thought about her father the way she had been thinking about him more lately, not as a figure of memory fixed and complete, but as a person who had continued to live and act and make decisions after she had driven away at 18 and stopped paying full attention. He had sold the house without telling her. He had asked Ray Walsh to store everything. He had hidden letters in the wall of the home he was leaving because her mother had insisted, and he had learned to trust that. He had clipped her name from newspapers he had no particular reason to be reading and saved the clippings in a wooden box. He had been doing things across all those years that she was only now learning the shape of. "My father said something else," Owen said. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "He said your mother came to see him before she died, came to the storage unit. She stood outside Unit 6, and she said she wasn't going to open it because she didn't want to disturb the organization. She just wanted to see it." He paused. He said she stood there for a few minutes, and then she said, "She'll come back for it. I know she will." And then she went home. The kitchen was very quiet. Ranger lay down near the table, his chin on his front paws, his eyes half closed in the warm light. The morning had opened out fully now, the sun high enough to clear the pines on the eastern ridge, the light coming through the clean windows and falling in long rectangles across the kitchen floor in the way Marin remembered from every breakfast of her childhood. Her mother had always said the kitchen was the best room in the house in the mornings. She had never understood that until now. She was right, Marin said. There was a long, comfortable silence. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the quality of her days. Not dramatically, there was no single morning when she woke and found everything resolved, no moment of clean transformation. It was subtler and more durable than that. The house was taking shape around her, each repaired room, returning to something like its original intention, each replaced board or refitted window, a small restoration of what the place had been before time, and vacancy had worked on it. She understood, without quite deciding it, that she was not preparing the house to sell. She was preparing it to live in. She drove over the bridge on the South Road one afternoon in late April, on her way back from the hardware store. She stopped in the middle of it and got out of the truck and walked to the railing and looked down at the river below, which was running fast with snowmelt brown and cold and purposeful. The bridge was solid. The railing was solid. The deckboards were worn but sound. Whatever her father had built here had been built to last, and it had. She drove home. That evening she sat on the porch swing, the one her mother had loved, which she had repaired in March, replacing the rotted suspension chain and sanding and repainting the wooden seat until it matched the photographs, and she watched the light move across the valley below Cedar Bluff as the sun descended toward the mountains in the west. The sky went through its sequence blue to gold, to the particular rose that appeared just before the actual sunset, the mountains catching it first along their highest ridges and holding it for a few minutes while the valley filled with shadow below. Ranger lay on the porch boards at her feet, his repaired legs stretched out comfortably. He had been off the splint for a week now. He was still careful with the legs, still favoring it slightly, but Owen had told her that was natural and would continue to improve. He was eating well. He had begun doing a slow perimeter check of the property each morning, limping slightly, but thorough, returning each time to sit beside her in the yard. She heard Owen's truck before she saw it. He pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment before getting out, as he always did, some private completion of whatever thought he had arrived with. He came up the porch steps with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the valley. Callum Reed says the Hartley property 2 roads over might come available in the fall, he said. Old barn and about 12 acres. He thought you might be interested. She looked at him. He thought I might be interested, she said. He thought someone with your particular set of skills and a German shepherd might make good use of 12 acres. And what do you think? Owen looked out at the valley for a moment. The last of the sunlight was moving off the lower ridges, now the sky above them deepening toward the particular blue that preceded full dark. I think Cedar Bluff could use more people who fix things instead of leaving when they get difficult, he said. But that's a personal opinion. She said nothing for a while. The swing moved slightly in the evening air. My mother knew I'd come back, she said. Not to him particularly. To the valley or to herself or to the woman who had stood outside a storage unit in her last year of life and said it out loud to someone who would remember. Yes, Owen said. I'm still not sure I would have. Without all of it. Without the letters, without your father, keeping everything without Frank telling me the truth about the house. Maybe not, he said. But you did. That was the whole of it. She did. The letters were on the wall inside, framed and level, her father's handwriting and her mother's side by side above the fireplace they had sat beside every winter of her childhood. The ring was on her hand. The kitchen table was in its original position against the east wall. The porch swing that her mother had loved was moving gently in the evening air beneath her. The house was not finished. There were rooms still to address details, still to resolve a winter's worth of deferred maintenance to work through before she could call the place truly sound. But the structure was solid. The foundation had held across all the years of vacancy and neglect in Wyoming weather, and what was built on it could hold too. She looked out across the valley at the mountains going dark and the first stars appearing above the western ridge, and the thing she felt was not happiness in any simple sense, and not peace in any final sense, but something more honest than either of those, a sense of being correctly located, of standing in the right place at the right time with the right person nearby and the right dog at her feet. Her mother had said, she will come back. There is something here waiting for her. The something was this, exactly this. Owen stood at the porch railing, looking out at the valley, and Ranger lay at her feet, breathing slowly in the cool evening air, and the swing moved in its small arc, and Cedar Bluff settled into the dark around them, the way it had settled into dark every evening for longer than any of them had been alive to see it. She had spent 20 years walking toward the most dangerous thing she could find. She was finished with that. She was home.